Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, July 10th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, in the military, mission success depends on understanding what people can actually do and matching them to the missions that need them. Plus, for pregnant Medicaid patients, finding care depends on information that's supposed to point them in the right direction, but actually may not. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is looking to rebuild its workforce after cutting more than a quarter of its employees last year, according to its top officials. But CDC employees heard similar messages from leadership months ago and have yet to see much hiring. Instead, the agency is relying on temporary reassignments to address staffing gaps, a strategy that is putting a toll on the workforce, according to employees. And this comes as CDC is upgrading its Ebola response to the highest level of threat. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman joins me with more details. Jory, thanks for being here.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
You and I have talked about CDC, it seems like, for the last 18 months. What is the current state of their workforce right now?
So the CDC is still dealing with some pretty significant staffing shortages. Compared to the beginning of the second Trump administration, the CDC is dealing with staffing loss of about a quarter to a third of its employees that are no longer there. And the Department of Health and Human Services more broadly is embarking on this pretty significant hiring surge. They're actually looking to get back to levels prior to the major RIF and reduction that we saw last year. So HHS has already done some considerable hiring already, and they're looking to hire about another 12,000 employees this year. CDC at this point, they've kind of been falling short on that priority as far as the hiring, and CDC employees say they really do need the personnel on board to handle a wide range of things going on. There's Ebola response. They recently concluded the response to the hantavirus, but other problems like New America screwworm and also other threats as well. They're really dealing with a broad portfolio of things, and also they've been activated for the FIFA World Cup.
What is the CDC leadership looking to do about this challenge?
Yeah, so more recently, CDC recently told employees at a town hall that they're going to go through what they call a strategic planning process, where they're going to understand where the gaps are in the CDC workforce. And based on that analysis, they're going to eventually go out and hire some people. This was all communicated by their new principal deputy director and chief operating officer, Steve Selensky. He spoke to employees at a recent CDC all-hands meeting at the headquarters in Atlanta. For some CDC employees, this kind of fell on deaf ears. They heard some of this before already. Back in March, the interim director, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who is also the Senate-confirmed director of the National Institutes of Health, said a lot of the same things. He said that CDC does have a need to hire and that they were especially going to focus on filling in some of the staffing gaps in CDC's chronic health departments.
So how have they been addressing some of the critical shortfalls in the meantime?
Well, one creative way to deal with that is that CDC has been relying on a lot of temporary reassignments, these 120-day temporary details that have been extended time and again in some instances. Basically, you're taking people from their day jobs, moving them to some other parts of the CDC that they are basically qualified for, but they may not have the specific background necessary to really thrive in these jobs. To give you one example, a CDC employee told me that someone in their office has been brought on board through one of these details to review some of the scientific information that goes on papers, the agency's public website, basically taking the doctorate level language and making sure it's understandable to a more general audience. That person doesn't really have a background in that work, and so as a result, the review for those publications, it's been slower. They've been putting out things at a slower cadence than they're used to.
As we sit now, though, they're facing this emergency response to the Ebola virus. So they're shorthanded. They don't have all the skills in all the right places. And now they've got a level 1 Ebola response. How are they pulling all of these things together?
Well, at some point, they're relying on things kind of day at a time, but Bhattacharya did put out a notice to all employees saying that this has been an upgraded response for Ebola, level 1, as you mentioned. For context, this is a pretty high-level situation here. Level 1 responses have been called for, of course, the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020, the pandemic, Zika, Hurricane Katrina, things of that nature. So a variety of threats there, but the vast majority of its activations are at the level 2 and 3, which are lower level threats. And so Bhattacharya is asking CDC employees to raise their hands and volunteer for these frontline deployments to handle the Ebola response in one way or another, going to airports domestically to screen passengers or possibly even going overseas to help with this response.
And you discovered that response could last 6 to 12 months. Do they have the capacity to maintain that level of mobilization?
We'll have to see. This really is a marathon, not a sprint. This is something that is going to be sustained for a while now, and all levels of CDC leadership acknowledge that they're going to have people rotate in to this work. It's not just always going to be the same people doing this work. It's going to be something that's going to ask a lot of the CDC workforce to pull off.
And what are you hearing now about the workforce's morale and motivation?
Well, CDC is aware that the morale is not great. A lot of CDC leadership at this recent town hall said as much, and they're trying to turn the page however they can. We're, of course, coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the shooting at the CDC campus that happened last August. It also somewhat coincides with the 80th anniversary of CDC. This actually happened in July, but they're going to try and tie all these things together, recognizing tough things, difficult things happened in the recent past for CDC, and they're hoping to see a brighter future. So as part of a 1-year commemoration of that shooting, they're going to name a street leading up to the campus after a police officer who was killed in the response, David Rose. Bhattacharya said that he really did sacrifice himself in the line of duty to save potentially CDC employees who could have been hurt or killed. However, in this meeting, he did get the officer's name wrong. He said it was Derek Rose, not David Rose. So that further kind of rankled some CDC employees, saying that just some attention has not been paid.
With all of this disruption, all of the emergencies that CDC has to respond to, and the turnover in key leadership positions, what is next for this critical agency?
Well, in addition to hiring rank and file employees, there's been a real push to fill some of the CDC's leadership ranks as well. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of the center-level leadership at CDC, those are acting officials. Slavinsky, who I mentioned earlier, coming into the CDC, he's worked in healthcare more broadly throughout his career, has a decades of experience in this field. He told employees he has never seen so many people in acting positions in any organization he's been at. Says that's something that's going to be a top priority to address.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. And Jory, let me just say, thanks. It's been a lot of fun to work with you. This will be your last time on the Federal Drive. We wish you all the best.
Thanks, Terry. It's been great.
You can find Jory's full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, in the military, the mission success depends on understanding what people can actually do and then matching them to the missions that need them. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Getting the right person into the right role has long been one of the military's toughest workforce challenges. The Pentagon is testing new ways to identify individual capabilities and use them in assignment and career decisions. The approach focuses on measurable performance rather than credentials alone. Joining me to explain what's changed to support this approach is Senior Scientist and Portfolio Lead at Aptima, Julia Brown. Julia, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
We have talked about military personnel in many ways here, and we've heard for years that even from places like RAND, the military needs to do a better job of matching people to jobs. Why is that so hard to actually do?
Well, I think it's that traditional personnel systems were built around broad categories. So things like occupational specialties, rank, and these experiential milestones. These are very important factors, but they don't tell the full story of what an individual can actually contribute. Especially now when military jobs have become increasingly complex and specialized, we really need to understand the full capabilities of the individual service members. And historically, we just haven't had a scalable way to capture all of that information and maintain it over time.
What kind of special skills are you talking about here? Are you thinking language skills, specific training, or, quantifiable skills?
All of those. And really from the behavioral science perspective, any skill can be quantified. So we're talking about things like anything from emotional intelligence to adaptability, tactical decision making, and technical skills as well. Really the gamut of all of the different capabilities that a person can bring to a job.
Then from your perspective, your background, what's different now? What makes tracking those kinds of qualifications something that the military personnel system could actually operationalize instead of just study?
I think there's a few things that are different now. In terms of the increases in our technological capabilities, we just have more access to data. And then with the inventions within AI, we have better ways to consolidate all of that data and understand the various patterns from it. So there are factors that we've really been collecting over time, but it's the scalability and the synthesization of the data that now is really affording these opportunities to understand the patterns and then better understand individual capabilities.
We had a conversation a few weeks ago about a question the Air Force was struggling with about trying to manage folks with Chinese language competency. Mm-hmm. If that was a question that you were trying to track, how would you actually do it?
Sure. So there's a variety of different ways, and really the multimodal assessments and multimodal methods of being able to track this is really the key here. So we have great language assessments, but we can also observe people speaking Chinese in actual context. We can see, are they fluent in their conversational skills? Are they fluent in their understanding, their reading? We can look at their performance during training and capture that. So being able to pull things from personnel records, like previous assessments that they've done, observations from training courses, observations in actual operational environments, and pulling all of those different data sources together to make a better estimate of that person's capability.
And your work then takes that, I would guess, one step further and talks about competency modeling. How do you measure competency when you take in all of those different data points?
So in terms of competencies, we look at competencies as a broad category for the knowledge, skills, and abilities that somebody is able to perform. Within each competency, you have various proficiency levels. So on any given competency, someone can range anywhere from beginner to expert in it. Oftentimes we have about 4 levels, but that can change depending on the organization. In addition to having these definitions of the competencies, including the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are contained within that category, you also have behavioral indicators at each level. So by having these real indicators that can be observed, then it's a lot easier to be able to track this is the level at which somebody is on this competency.
And are those things that just can be measured in the course of someone doing their normal duty, or do you have to have regular measurement sessions to kind of collect that data so that you can assess competency growth and development?
Yes, definitely both. You can have the real power here is to have the different inputs to kind of form that overall estimate of where somebody is on a given competency. So that should absolutely grow over time, and having a constant stream of data adding towards that is really what makes this methodology very powerful.
Julia Brown is Senior Scientist and Portfolio Lead at Aptima. Julia, I think the power here is not only establishing an individual's competency in certain skills, but then connecting that to the assignment process. So walk us through how what you're doing connects to assignments, how the military can then maybe optimize best fit for the position.
Yeah, absolutely. So at a high level, what we're doing is really building a richer understanding of both sides of the equation. That is on the side of the individual and a profile that reflects the various competencies, skills, experience, and qualifications that they have demonstrated over time. And then on the position side, we also define the capabilities required for successful performance. The system then takes those things, and competencies provide that common language to do so, and compares the profiles and identifies areas of alignments. So instead of asking traditionally, does this person belong to the right career field? It's how closely does this person's capability profile align with what this mission set and this position actually requires? So we surface all of that information within this assignments process, but we still, very importantly, rely on human judgment to be the final decision makers to evaluate this broader pool of candidates and uncover what the strong matches might be.
Within the military, there's a tension between someone having deep and narrow expertise in a particular space and someone having a very broad exposure to lots of areas. And especially when you're thinking about leader development, oftentimes you want someone that has a little bit of both. They're fairly competent in one particular area, but they've also had a number of broadening assignments. How do you balance that in the models that you're thinking of? General competency, leadership attributes versus specific skill competency?
Absolutely. So we can categorize these groups of competencies then into more foundational competencies that any service wants service members to have that reflect that service's core identity, their core values. Also leadership competencies, and then technical competencies as well. What having this kind of mapping or framework of competencies does is you can see where an individual is developing. And in terms of workforce analytics too, you can also plan ahead to see what is the health of the pipeline within this career field even. So do we have enough people that are building these technical capabilities? And when we have the positions that are also aligned with the competency framework, we can see if I put them in this position, what opportunities do they have to grow in a given area? Are they growing their leadership competencies here? Is this a broadening assignment? Or are they getting more deep technical experience? And what does the service need?
The military personnel management system is very much an industrial age approach. Right? You get cohorts of people, you move them through different paths and career assignments, and they make certain ranks at certain times, or they don't, right? So how is the knowledge that you're gaining through this competency model going to change the industrial age general personnel model so that we can really focus on the individual? That's going to change career progressions and conceptions of career advancement, isn't it?
I think so. I think this framework really adds to the individual and their development capabilities, because if you can see where you want to go within a given service and then what competencies are required to get to that position, and then you have learning resources that are tied to those competencies, you can see what other assignments can I take that can help me build to this assignment that I want. We're trying to take out the linear trajectory of this career path and allow for more broader experiences. And by providing that autonomy and flexibility to service members, our hope is that it helps to retain them and to give them more control over where they want to go and more authority to say, this is the thing that I want to build. And so these are the steps that I can take to get there.
How are you seeing this new approach play out on the ground in the military services?
I think that it still requires a lot of human oversight, and it will. But what it's doing is it's surfacing a lot larger amounts of data to provide for the decision makers to make better informed decisions. We still very much rely on our leaders to make those decisions. There will always be a lag in the data that are needed to make some of these personnel decisions, but it can lead to better informed decisions and faster identification of qualified candidates, and then the greater ability to align talent with the mission requirements.
And if we follow this approach over time, what would you expect to be different 2 to 5 years in the future?
I think if this is working well, then commanders and personnel managers have greater visibility into the talent available to them. So instead of searching through lots of records and relying on primarily these broad qualifications, they can see a richer picture of capabilities and across their workforce. So I think we'll see more of putting the right person in the right job at the right time. And that's really driven by the changes and advances in the behavioral sciences, competency modeling, and AI that are allowing us to do that at scale.
Julia Brown is Senior Scientist and Portfolio Lead at Aptima. Julia, I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you so much, Sherry. It's been great to talk with you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, federal agencies make thousands of decisions about the workforce every day. A new OPM rule could expand how some of those decisions get made. But first, for pregnant Medicaid patients, finding care depends on information that's supposed to point them in the right direction, but actually may not. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Access to care starts with knowing where care actually exists. New findings from the HHS Inspector General show that the provider information Medicaid patients and state officials rely on is often inaccurate or incomplete. Joining me now is Laura Cordish, Regional Inspector General for Evaluation and Inspections at the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of the Inspector General. Laura, it is great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
You've got a couple of really important reports out that we want to dive into because Medicaid covers a large share of births in the United States, and states rely heavily on managed care. But you started to look at how maternal care is playing out in that system. What prompted the investigation here?
We wanted to better understand how accurate the provider information that states and Medicaid enrollees rely on is. And we looked at the information patients use to find maternal health care providers and make appointments. And we also looked at the information that Medicaid managed care plans give to states to oversee access. And we looked at this now because the U.S. is in the midst of a maternal health crisis with worse pregnancy outcomes than any other high-income country. And, as you noted, Medicaid covers a big share of those births, over 40%, and most of those are managed care. So we thought it was important to review because if enrollees can't reliably find providers, it could prevent them from getting essential prenatal and postpartum care.
When you looked at the list that the providers, the insurance providers actually give to states, what did you find? Were they accurate?
Not very accurate. 1 in 4 of the network providers on the list that plans submit were not actually in network. In other words, on paper, the managed care plans may have met the requirement to have adequate providers, but in reality, nearly a quarter were not in network. And we refer to these as ghost providers because they're not actually available to pregnant enrollees for appointments. In addition, another 26% of listed providers didn't have any accurate phone numbers. So overall, the list from plans had significant errors that can undermine oversight of access and ultimately inhibit patient care.
So there's some real ramifications from those inaccuracies. Walk us through how this is supposed to work, both from how the states use these lists and how patients are supposed to use these lists.
Yes, states are responsible for ensuring that patients in Medicaid managed care plans have access to care. And one way states oversee this is by checking to see if plans have enough providers in their networks. States compare network lists from plans to their network adequacy standards. So, for example, state standards may require a certain number of OBGYN providers for every 1,000 enrollees, or state standards may require that plans have one maternal health provider within a certain distance, say 30 miles of each enrollee. So it's important that these lists from plans are correct.
And how does a patient use these lists?
So patients use these lists to find the providers that are available to them. And we looked at the same information that patients use to find providers, and we found a number of problems. For example, we found ghost providers, providers who are listed or not actually available. And you can imagine how frustrating that is. We also found providers that were available but not listed. In this case, a patient might be having trouble finding a provider, and there is someone actually available to them, but they don't know about it. And then in other cases, the providers were right, but the contact information was wrong. So for a pregnant woman needing time-sensitive care, these problems aren't just annoying. They can be serious obstacles to care and cost precious time and ultimately lead to worse outcomes for moms and babies.
Laura Cordish is the Regional Inspector General for Evaluation and Inspections at the Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General. Laura, those are really important outcomes. I mean, when we talk about, well, the data wasn't complete or wasn't accurate, it sounds very dry, but this gets to real personal impact. It also has managerial impact on the program. If the lists are wrong, what does that do to the oversight practices? What can providers or the states no longer see or verify?
Yeah, inaccurate lists undermine states' oversight of network adequacy. States use these lists to compare against requirements, and if the lists are faulty, states might draw the wrong conclusions about whether plans are meeting their requirements. For example, if the list from the managed care plan on paper is more robust than in reality, that might mask a shortage that the state would want to know about. And if the contact information is wrong, it's hard to verify providers on the list. So those are some ways that inaccurate data can undermine oversight by masking problems and making it harder for patients to figure out where they will get needed maternal health care.
We also hear a lot of concern about fraud in the Medicaid space. Are you concerned that the inaccuracies in these provider lists may be a window into Medicaid fraud?
We can't tell that from this study, but what we can say is that we found many inaccuracies with the provider information, and these inaccuracies can really undermine state oversight and interfere with patients getting needed care.
Well, you did make a number of recommendations in these reports for both CMS and for the states. When you walk through those, what's the most important change that would actually improve visibility into these networks?
Most important thing is holding plans accountable for accurate provider information. And, we offer ideas on how states could do this. For example, states could set their own standards for accuracy rates for provider information. They could strengthen contract language with managed care plans to reflect their expectations for accuracy. They could consider enforcement strategies like penalizing noncompliance. But at the end of the day, with billions of public dollars invested, Medicaid enrollees shouldn't have to guess where to find care. Accurate provider information is fundamental to making this system work.
Laura, one of the recommendations in the reports is that CMS improve or strengthen its accountability measures. But what would that really require of states? Are there things that they can do right now that would improve their accuracy?
One idea would be for states to use one list of providers instead of two and focus on keeping that list updated. So we found in our work that managed care companies are submitting one list to the states for oversight, and then a second list is populating the provider directories that enrollees use to find care. And we found significant errors on both lists, and the lists didn't match. So if states wanted a quick action to help improve their oversight, one idea for them is to just use one list and keep that up to date.
And do you find that the states have the capacity to manage that complexity?
That's a great question. I think you'd have to ask the states.
What will the follow-up for this be? I mean, this is a significant issue. As you had explained, it has a really palpable impact on maternal care. How do you follow up on something like this?
Sure. So OIG follows up on all of our recommendations. Within 6 months of publications of the report, we ask the agency to provide specific actions in a timeline, and then we follow up annually on status. And then we're always evaluating topics for new work. And we do have another item in progress on our published work plan on maternal health related to reducing costs and improving outcomes for Medicaid managed care enrollees diagnosed with preeclampsia. And I can forward you that information if you would like it.
That would be great, and we'll share it with our listeners as well. Laura Cordish is Regional Inspector General for Evaluations and Inspections at the Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General. Laura, thanks so much for sharing these reports with us today.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, federal agencies make thousands of decisions about the workforce every day. A new OPM rule could expand how some of those decisions get made. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Hiring someone is only the beginning of the government's relationship with an employee. A newly finalized OPM rule expands the agency's authority to pursue suitability actions for certain misconduct that occurs after hiring, raising new questions about accountability and workforce management. Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with Michael Fallings, managing partner at Tully Rinke, to find out more about what's changing.
So the rule has been publicized for a few days now, and it involves suitability actions that can be taken against certain federal employees for misconduct occurred after they are hired. Why don't we kind of start from before time? What did suitability mean before this new rule, and then we can kind of get into some of the changes?
Sure. So suitability means whether a federal employee is suitable for the job. So when an employee is going through the application process, certain agencies would conduct a suitability review to ensure that the employee is eligible for employment. Certain things could mean that an employee is not suitable for the position, such as, maybe even a prior criminal history or a prior job history as well, that an agency could cause an employee not to be hired for a position. So that is where it was. Now, employees that maybe faced a suitability determination that they weren't eligible for the position could still appeal those actions to the Merit Systems Protection Board, but that is where it was prior to this rule.
Got it. Okay. And with this rule, let's get into it itself. What does it say, and how will it affect employees when they are deemed either suitable or not suitable? What changed exactly?
Well, this rule allows federal agencies to take suitability actions for post-appointment conduct, which is a major change because when taking a suitability action for post-appointment conduct, the agency does not have to go through the due process procedures. Previously, if there were something to happen after the employee was hired, the employee would at least receive notice and an opportunity to respond, typically even some sort of investigation as well. With a suitability action, the government could just issue a notice saying, we are finding you unsuitable based on conduct that even occurred after your appointment to the job. Now, that could still be appealable and challenged, but the employee doesn't have that due process right that I mentioned.
Got it. Okay, so while also hindering a little bit of your ability to fight the suitability charge, it seems as if the administration also wants to stretch how and what it can define as, or when it uses the term suitability, it wants to be able to use that for more faults, I guess you could say, of an employee. Is that correct?
Yes. It expands really the time frame from where you could be found unsuitable. So you could be working in a position and then be found unsuitable for conduct that occurred after the fact. It does make federal employment less secure, for these employees that are used to having at least some due process with regards to any action against them. In addition, it allows for the government to use additional reasons to take those actions against the employees.
What is the legal standpoint there of, this is going through the comment period right now. This also hinders one's ability to appeal when they are deemed not suitable for a position. What is the possible legal remedy then for them if they're not able to appeal or anything like that? Are there other violations that could be at play here?
Well, if they are prohibited from appealing, the employees could still go to court and still file in court litigation alleging this is a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, potentially, depending on the type of employee, alleging a prohibited personnel practice. And there's a lot going on with that to see whether the employees could still file that. Now, if there's a discrimination basis behind it, they could still go to the EO office. But if there's a prohibition on actually appealing a suitability action, then what I would recommend is probably trying to take it into federal court for the employee to continue to challenge that.
We're speaking here with Michael Fallings. He is the managing partner with Tully Rinke. This all comes while the Trump administration has also put out a new stipulation for future or current federal employees to sign non-disclosure agreements. Could not signing that agreement saying, I can't abide by this or I don't think it's necessary, could that also find you deemed as unsuitable?
I believe that's what the administration is going towards. I think for employees that, from my knowledge, those agreements are given to, employees that are applying to the government, but if they're also given to employees that are, within the government, I think that's what they may find is that you're not agreeing to our non-disclosures agreement. You're not agreeing to keep items confidential. And so we're not finding you as suitable for the position because you can't agree to our terms. I would encourage employees to challenge that through the available methods, but I believe that is what this administration is going for.
Yeah, because that brings in so many other aspects, right? I mean, there's whistleblower protection rights and, that pesky First Amendment rights that allows you to say whatever you want to say, right? I mean, you may have grounds there if it comes down to that.
Yes. Regarding the NDA, I think the major concern has been as the First Amendment rights for employees. Federal employees have First Amendment rights, and the language regarding the NDA hasn't been as clear on what it is actually being that's deemed confidential. The whistleblower rights as well. Now, I know the proposed language regarding that says that employees could still blow the whistle, so to speak, but I don't think it's as clear, and it definitely puts fear in employees' minds about, well, could they really? Well, what may happen if I do? Could there be retaliation? So that agreement, that NDA is also concerning. But, as you said, it seems like the government may try to use failure to sign the NDA as a reason to remove an employee.
Where does this stand as far as OPM's overall changes that they want to make to federal hiring oversight and workforce planning? We're seeing different changes from them on staffing plan requirements, enhanced oversight from chief human capital officers. What is the grand plan here that OPM is going for, you think?
Well, it appears to be trying to reduce the federal workforce and to make it easier for federal agencies to remove employees. Federal employees have had rights to protect their employment for a number of years, for decades, and it appears OPM through the administration is trying to take that away. I think there was a recent proposed rule even about shortening performance improvement plan periods, taking away the due process rights and the analysis, the factors that government agencies must use to determine whether to discipline somebody. I think that was issued maybe just today as well. So all of these proposed rules and regulations appear to allow the agencies to remove these employees quickly without due process and without litigation.
Michael Fallings is managing partner with Tully Rinke. Thank you so much for providing the insight.
No, thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. In the 3 weeks since the General Services Administration updated its proposed regulations for the basic safeguarding of data within large language model artificial intelligence systems, vendors and other interested parties have officially submitted only a handful of comments. But that's not because there isn't a lack of interest or questions about the new proposed rule that GSA would apply to all schedule and government-wide acquisition contracts under their purview. The comments will likely start pouring in after GSA holds a listening session on July 14th in Washington, D.C. For more on what GSA included in the updated draft regulations and what questions still remain, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, joins me now. Jason, great to have you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Terry.
All right, remind me and our listeners about what these draft regulations are and why GSA updated them.
This goes back to March when GSA released really what they call a 9-page draft clause that would require vendors providing AI tools and services to the government and really through the GSA scheduled contracts to meet a host of specific requirements, including ensuring things like only American AI systems are used, disclosing all AI systems used in the performance of such a service to the government, requiring the government to own all data, and really some custom developments. It was really this draft clause was really put a lot of pressure on industry, caused a lot of concern. I think GSA got a lot of feedback right away, and I think this caused a lot of concern in industry. So to GSA's credit, they took a full step back. They said, okay, let us get some of this feedback. Let us put a pause on this draft clause, and let us have a better, more complete, if you will, understanding of what's going on. And I think that's what we saw back in early June when they released the updated, I'll call it draft regulations for AI systems. And what this now does is not just apply to the schedules, but they actually said that we're going to apply this to all government-wide acquisition contracts. So think Oasis Plus, think Alliant 3, think Polaris, think anything that has a technology system or technology services, because they, Terry, they're going to have some AI in there these days.
With all of that feedback and that broad application, it's going to be really important that GSA get this right. What did they change in the update?
First of all, I think the whole approach they took was different. They didn't just put it out there saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. What do you think? They actually released an RFI. And in that RFI, they basically said, hey, here's some questions we want you to answer. Here are some things to think about. So, for instance, GSA asked vendors to weigh in on several big things like, does this change in the clause prescription adequately address previous concerns about the broadness of the previous clause that we just talked about? They asked things like, what about government data ownership and protection? What's how to define accountability for contractors? Is that clearly defined? They asked about the roles and responsibilities of the contractor, the large language model developer, the large language model system operator, so on and so forth. So they're asking for more questions. They actually also are asking about flow down clauses, right? So I'm the prime contractor, I have the contract, but I'm using AI as subcontractors. How does that flow down work? So a lot of these are really important questions. And, I talked to several different people and they all praised GSA. For instance, I spoke with Jose Arrieta. He's a former HHS CIO. He's a former director of GSA's IT schedule. So he has acquisition, he has technology. And today he's the founder of an AI company called Imagineer. And he called this the most consequential rule since probably FedRAMP, the cloud security program that was FedRAMP that we've seen. And what he said was, listen, they've done a lot of really good things with this. For instance, he talked about the government ownership and data requirements, the way they changed that. He goes, that was really smart. I also talked to Jessica Tillotman. She's the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies at the George Washington University. And she also says GSA addressed some of the problems that she saw, such as they got rid of the lawful use and mandatory Made in America provision. She said that was just not workable. She also talked about the separate flow down requirements for the LLM for, again, subcontractors and so on and so forth, second tier, third tier subcontractors. She goes, now there's 4 different clauses, and GSA created an attestation provision to help mitigate some of those flow down requirements to prime contractors. So again, really smart things, really, really important changes that they made. So I think there's a lot of things that GSA listened, they heard, most importantly, and then they said, okay, how can we improve? And I think that's what this initial draft showed us.
And as you're having those conversations, Jason, and the listening session is coming up, what sort of feedback is left to give? What are people hoping that GSA will still address?
there's several big questions, and of course there are, because you're not going to get it right the first time, and I think that's what GSA put the RFI out for. But going back to something Jose Arrieta highlighted to me, he goes, there's a prohibition in there of foreign ownership requirements around LLMs. He goes, this day and age, that's really difficult because of the way development happens. It happens globally. And even, that's really going to be impactful to small and medium-sized businesses who are using a lot of open source software, a lot of things that are developed across the globe in different time zones. And he said even for some of the larger companies, that may be a very difficult thing to do. So I think he wants something around how to ensure some, okay, if you're going to put a prohibition on foreign ownership, what does that really mean, and how much does that flow down? Another thing that came up, I think, around that Jessica Tillotman talked about was this idea of ideological neutrality. This is something that's big on the administration, the no woke AI, if you will. She says, what does that mean? She goes, yes, GSA tightened this a little bit, but that she believes that clause will cause a lot of problems for a lot of people, because what does compliance mean? How do you ensure compliance? She actually called ideological neutrality kind of a mushy term. And I think that's a very legal term because she's a lawyer, Another part is the GSA talked about benchmarks for testing for this woke AI. What are those benchmarks going to look like? So I think that's a definition that I think that will still come from GSA. So I think there's still a lot of these questions that are out there, that good questions. They make a lot of sense. We've seen progress. So one industry executive I saw said one thing that they're excited about is GSA wants to work with the environment, the community, and to get this right. And that's a very positive sign.
It sounds like they're on the right path then. What are the next steps to get this to closure?
Well, the big thing that you mentioned is the July 14th listening session. Now, for folks who say, I want to go to that, unfortunately, registration closed July 3rd. But there may be an opportunity. Maybe GSA has a virtual option, but this is in person at Washington, D.C. at the George Washington University. And I think that listening session will be key. Now, the interesting thing about a listening session is not GSA presenting anything. I mean, they may present a very high level, hey, this is what we did. Now talk to us. But people are able to come up and present their questions, their suggestions, their recommendations, their concerns to GSA, who's able to take all those notes and then maybe apply it to how the future draft AI regulations will come out. So I think that's the one key thing. The other thing is, as I said, I checked the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs website, the regulations.gov, that lists all the comments. There was only a handful. I think when I looked, maybe last week, it was 6. That's not a lot of comments for something that caused a lot of consternation across industry. So I think post this listening session, I'll be interested to see how many comments come in. This administration is getting a lot of comments. Terry, we talked when you were away about grants regulations and some changes, and they had over 3,600 comments on the changes to grants regulations. I would expect this AI clause to get hundreds, if not thousands, of comments as well. But again, I think after the listening session. So I think those are the two big things for me. And then, of course, the finalization. These things can take months and months to get through the comments and then to finalize them. So that's something maybe early in 2027.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for bringing this to the top of our to-do list.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Terry. Find
his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.